It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. If you're listening on release day, then tomorrow, December 3rd, is Giving Tuesday. And if you'd like to participate, I highly recommend a gift to CLGS. They're doing truly groundbreaking work with their games press, and if you'd like to see board games become both a more prevalent learning tool and a more common form of scholarly expression, this is a great time to show your support. I will also mention that if you want to support this podcast, please visit patreon.com/beyondsolitaire and help me keep the lights on. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I have two very special guests. I've got Natalia Zwarts. She is a lecturer at the Hague University, and I have Chris Gledhill. He's a professor of English linguistics at Solitaire. And we're going to talk about a political game that they've both been working on. That's meant to model relations between Russia and Ukraine. I know, quite topical for those of you in the States right now. So, how are y'all doing? And could you just kind of tell the people about this Polymatrix game?
Thank you for having us. I will shortly start with the design of the game, and Chris will be able to say more about the scientific analysis behind it. What Polymatrix is a game that shows the situation in Ukraine, but it is split into political negotiations and military actions. So we are able to see the dynamics of both, and a bit in the background, we were trying to see if there is a formula for peace negotiations that would work. And that came to me when we had a visit of President Zelensky last year at the Hague University, and he very simply said we should do what we can in our roles to solve this conflict. And I thought, as researchers, intellectuals, we still had a way to go, because I have not seen a formula for peace that was proposed that would be realistic and viable. So this game is showing us ways of one reasoning to solving this situation. Or sometimes the conclusion can be we need something else, and that's also maybe sad but realistic. And we came into cooperation with Chris Gledhill and Li Shao from Solitaire, because they were thinking whether language plays a role in this kind of negotiations.
Right. Thanks. Thanks for having us, Liz. It's nice to talk about the project. And yeah, I was during breakdown a few years, during a lockdown a few years ago in the COVID crisis, I was looking at playthroughs on YouTube, playthroughs of various diplomacy games. In fact, I think it was Westphalia by Hollandspiel. And I was so fast. I was looking at different playthroughs of those kind of games and thinking I should work on this kind of language before I'd worked on different types of written language. But this was spoken language, very complex, and it was the negotiation phase that I found absolutely hilarious and absolutely fascinating from a linguistic point of view. And at around about the same time, I think I'd ordered a couple of books. I was looking at Natalia's book. In fact, I just ordered it when Natalia was Natalia Vojtovic, and it's the title has escaped me now, but it was basically one of her books. I think it's Wargaming Experiences. And I was thinking, I could use some of these ideas and convert some of my classes from a kind of traditional lecture where I talk about English or talk about a topic to a game-oriented or even a game itself. And I still haven't quite worked out how to do that. So if you have any ideas on that, I'd be interested. But anyway, at that point, I thought, why don't we get some recordings of these sessions? So that's what we're doing right now. We're recording. So Natalia and her team in The Hague with the students and with her colleagues is recording matrix sessions like the one you took part in, Liz.
Yes.
Okay. And we're recording it, and then what happens is she sends us the recording, and we are transcribing that. You can do it automatically, but we're using rather more sophisticated systems to transcribe, to recognize the different voices. So that, for example, there's a system which can actually recognize the different voices, attribute to each voice a number, a code. And then what I'm doing is with what we're hoping to do is we're going to label the different parts of the talk. So, for example, there are parts of the discussion which are Natalia or the moderator explaining the game rules, people asking questions about the game rules. Then there's a section where people discuss and enact things during the game. And then there's the negotiations in the game. And so we're interested in doing a kind of detailed linguistic analysis of that.
Oh, that's really interesting. All right, I'm going to hit you with some more questions about that in a second. But for those of you who have not seen or played this game, as somebody who played it, and then maybe y'all can come in and actually fill in. I was getting sick that day, so let's see how well I remember what's happening. We played this with 5 people. So one person basically took on the role of Ukraine, one person took on the role of Russia, and then everybody else was a judge. And so what would happen is that they would spend resources to kind of have an initial part of the turn where they were relocating forces and kind of getting ready for the next phase. And then each side would propose an action that was of varying power, but also it was riskier that the judges might say no. And so they had to pick what they wanted to do, describe like how it would happen and like how they would make it an effective action. And then like we the judges had to decide how credible we thought that proposal was. And it wasn't like a zero sum game. You could just say, oh well, maybe it would be partially effective and like assign consequences that way. But it was like a game with umpires who had to agree and then 2 players who were trying to kind of scramble to deal with limited resources, take actions. They were upsetting their populaces to see how much like pain the people could take. Is that about right?
That's right. I do have to say, normally we have also a prominent negotiation phase, but your group was very determined not to negotiate. So that would be in other sessions more prominent. And we also split it into topics people could focus on. So we added cybersecurity, we added culture, we added prisoners of war. So there were different aspects to the negotiations you could choose, or simply saying, well, we will withdraw from this city if you promise not to attack this one. So it's both territorial and topical agreements you could reach. But as you have mentioned, it can also be that players say there are no conditions under which I want to negotiate, and they move directly into action.
Yes. Yeah, I think my own perception of the game was changed by that. So this leads to a good question for both of you. What kind of range of approaches have you seen in the groups that have played the game? And what role does negotiation play? Do people seem inclined to try to play nice, or do people seem inclined to try to fight it out more of the time?
I think I will not spoil the game if I say what we have done mechanically is we actually, in total, assigned almost the same number of points to both sides. So if you would negotiate different things, you would come out at the same position. But what is happening, and it's very human and also very political, if there is a negotiation where I would lose even 1 point, so the other side gets 6, I get 5, I will refuse to negotiate it as a player. And we noticed people do not see the whole sum, they see the small things and technically where they are losing advantage. So that played a huge role. It is based also on the theory of costly concessions. And there it was proposed that there is a moment in war where one of the sides, if they are losing, if their costs are growing, they would be more inclined to negotiate. Unfortunately, we have found the opposite. So even at the worst moment, at the round 3, where all of the indicators are getting worse, we see that both players still refuse to choose negotiations as a better option. So there we started to investigate where war could be, for some sides, seen as more beneficial than going towards peace. So we had a group that precisely saw through these mechanics, and they said, "Hey, why don't we just negotiate the whole package?" And they were able to decide to split territory and split the points for the topics, which are fairly equal. But most of the groups fall into the same phenomenon, that we perceive it as less beneficial for multiple reasons. And we were able to look at it both quantitatively but also linguistically. So I think Chris could say more about the phrases that he noticed with the negotiations.
Yeah.
Perfectly right on my next question. Let's hear it.
Okay. Well, I mean, just to come back to what you were saying about negotiation, it's interesting because I've not listened to all of the recordings yet. But even so, I think there's the session you took part in, pretty much every player refused to negotiate, and they were kind of playing a role there, but there was still negotiation going on. So every single segment in that discussion, which took just over an hour, is given a label in our analysis, and there's still negotiation anyway. So even in the action, there's an action phase and there's a negotiation phase. And in the action phase, the players have to justify their actions anyway. And so the other player will get to, as I think you saw that the other player counter argued. Sometimes they didn't, but they had the option to do so even during that phase. So we've still got negotiation. And anyway, from a linguistic point of view, all conversation is, the word negotiation is used in linguistics, in conversation analysis and discourse analysis, to talk about how we negotiate meaning. It's not transmitted from brain to brain. Meaning, from this point of view, this functional point of view, is negotiated. The verb we use is negotiate meaning. So the meaning of this conversation we're having now is being negotiated right now. It's not decided yet, but maybe at the end we will say, oh, that was a successful conversation. That was an unsuccessful conversation. That was that was an easy conversation. That was fun. We will evaluate that in a meta way, but it'll be based on our perceptions of how the conversation or how the interaction went according to our expectations. And the other point maybe about negotiation is that I guess I was thinking about in terms of game structure, and whether if you wanted to engineer negotiation, whether it would be worth introducing a kind of United Nations or a kind of court of public opinion, where the players, and this is really a point, maybe a question for Natalia, whether if we really wanted them to negotiate, they may have to justify not negotiating. Say, well, why? How does this work? How does not negotiating play well with your side of the argument?
I really like the question of engineering negotiations. So some of the participants of the game mentioned, well, if you wanted people to negotiate, you should have incentivized negotiations. But at that point, I thought, well, we do not actually want to tell them what to do. We want them to choose freely from the available options. So we did not make them more attractive than others, which was for me realistic in terms of I need to choose as a player best move. And at that time, negotiations, if you compare them with military action, are indeed rarely chosen as the solution. And it's true that they are also not neatly separated. Very often you will, while doing military action, think to negotiate one of the topics. So this is also something I think that was difficult to analyze, but very valuable to see that it's not separate. It is very much in combination. And we were looking as well mechanically how we could, I think that's a great word, engineer the negotiations in a way that is still realistic to the situation.
Yeah, I guess this actually leads to a question of, if you're trying to simulate a real situation that pulls in real events and real consequences, how do you choose what to incentivize in a way that actually reflects the situation and not just what you'd like to see people do? And how, who's who's discussing that with y'all to kind of make sure that you're not putting too much of yourselves into a situation that is beyond us all.
I think the answer will be, again, fairly in the realm of conclusions, because we did set out to find a formula for peace, and we have not. So we did not incentivize it to appear. We said, if under these conditions negotiations would not be successful, what else would be a solution? So there was no mechanical notion of you should be negotiating. So in every explanation is you have three options: the negotiation, the military action, or the matrix actions, which are based on the discussion and can bring more qualitative insights. And that is how we wanted to keep it. So the scoring was relative. And here you could indeed make critical questions: why 6, why 10? But it was relative to how important it was to each player, which means they had asymmetrical number of points for different things. And some of them were just logical loops. Let's say Crimea, if Russia would lose it, it would be a massive fallout. So they got 10 points for keeping it, whereas Ukraine got less for returning it to themselves, because that would likely be a mix of sabotage and takeover. So we had to look through a number of these logical connections and try to assemble a model. And I think we will all agree, every model is an approximation of reality. It's not the reality itself. So the question was, where were we willing to simplify it? One of the things we did was we didn't split into Air Force, Navy, land forces. We said it's a military asset, right? And if you have military advantage, you would be, let's say, ruling this area. So it's more zone of control rather than the calculation of military power. And that was for us enough approximation to show whether people are choosing political or military instruments for a given scoring. So that was a relative power simplification in this model. And again, for me, the focus was on modeling how the players would be choosing between the options.
Interesting. And then, Chris, when you are analyzing what is said in these games, how do you decide what it is that you should look for more, that you should keep focusing on, and what has that been revealing for you?
Oh, that's a nice question. That's a whole methodological question in linguistics, because, of course, 50 years ago, before the advent of computational linguistics and corpus linguistics, it was the researcher. The researcher would look at the data and decide what they were interested in. So I've gone through some of these conversations and just picked out what I've been interested in myself. But the other way of doing things, and the way that we're supposed to do things now, is oriented towards computational linguistics. So we've not finished the data analysis yet. So in theory, we can't say yet, but just going through the conversation myself, what we call manual analysis, we've got moments in the game, in fact, not in the negotiation phase, but in the action phase, where we have negotiation. And one of the players says something like, there's a proposal to do something, and the player says, I flatly reject that. So that's a very interesting, that for the linguist, that's immediately, we recognize that immediately as what's called a performative or a speech act. And that is a bit like saying, I hereby name this ship, or I hereby declare war, or I hereby declare you man and wife, or whatever. So these very traditional phrases that you get in games anyway, things like checkmate, or there are all sorts of phrases that you can use in these games. And in this particular kind of game, there is a point where the negotiation either continues. In this particular case, if the player had said, I will reject that, simply, it could be seen as simply, well, I'm signaling to you now that I'm not going to accept that condition, but if you come with another condition, I will maybe consider that. Whereas if you say, I will flatly reject that, with the kind of tone of voice, with the intonation, everything is there to say this is a rejection and the negotiation is closed. And the game master at that point, the game moderator at that point, just said okay. And the word okay then also acts as a phrasally. It says, okay, well, I'm taking this floor now because I see that the negotiation is over. So there are literally dozens of these moments in these. Each hour gives us dozens of these, and I can identify them manually. But that's not the point of the project, because none of my colleagues will ever believe my analysis. So they will not take that. They will say, but if I come along with a corpus and I say, here, I've got statistics, and Li Chao, his job, my collaborator, Li Chao Xu, is going to put all of this in the corpus, to say things simply. I'm going to label all of these, or with a team of students, in fact, we're going to label each segment. So, for example, that one is, I think I've labeled it nego close. It could have two labels: nego response, that's a response to a probe, question answer, probe response, that's the usual way of labeling it. But it's also nego close, which is close of negotiation. I hereby close this negotiation, could have said formally. And I'm just going to label that. And then what the computer can do is, if we have dozens of these instances of nego close, we can say, oh, well, they all use the same phraseology. They all use the same wording, the same, maybe sometimes even terminology, pronoun usage, the use of the passive, the use of change of voice is something that we would have to look at in the future. But you actually do hear the change in tone when people are changing according to the function of what they're saying. They will change tone. For example, if they're role playing, you can tell when they're role playing. When they are grandstanding and they're getting immersed in, they will change the pronoun. They will start calling themselves, my name is Vladimir, or I'm Volodymyr, the other guy in the conflict. So, and that that is, for a linguist, that is not just bread and butter. That is the icing, the cake, the whole thing. That for me, that is something I can listen to dozens and dozens of times. So I've listened to your conversation literally 3 or 4 times before I can come to that analysis. It does take time to do the analysis manually, but on the basis of the manual analysis, then we get the computer, then we have a corpus. So that is how we decide. I'm not deciding alone. What I'm doing, there's an interface between the manual analysis and the corpus, what we call corpus analysis, or the computational statistical analysis, so that very often what we're saying is not intuitive. It's something that is taken for granted, but it's there in the data, usually in terms of patterns. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that we don't necessarily appreciate, outside of work like yours, how similar a lot of our phrasing in conversations really are. So like that's just really interesting to think about. So these are like the same phrases showing up from game to game,
Well,
or
actually, yeah, that's interesting. That for some, it's a really complex question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to go on about this, but it's it's a matter of fascination. And the one thing is, we're not using the same phrases, so the students can't go away and go, okay, I'm going to use this phrase. This is the phrase I use to close a conversation, or this is the phrase I use to win a negotiation. I think that would be a simplistic approach. Would be to say, okay, what are the best phrases? It is an approach that's used. Natalia's found a paper where in fact they come up with something like that. They say, oh, these are the phrases that people use in successful communications, and these are the phrases and words that people use in unsuccessful communication. Then it's true that you can get a statistical distribution like that. But actually, I think that what's interesting is it's very rarely exactly the same. It's almost always different. It's almost always a different phrasing. And so what is amazing is to see how many different ways there are of saying the same thing. We're not going to find, I'm pretty sure that I'm never going to find that phrase again. I will flatly refuse that. I don't think I'm ever going to see that in any of the other negotiations. It's going to be other ways of phrasing that. And so that's what makes language so complex. And is that we understand what people are saying, and yet virtually every phrase they use, every statement they use is almost completely novel. It's a novel combination of existing phrases and existing words, of course.
that's so interesting. Okay, we're gonna circle back, but Natalia, I know you have limited time, so Honestly, I think I'm just going to ask the awful question, which was how much was this game designed to respond to current world events? And what do we do? I mean, we're recording this for those of you who are out there on November 7th. It's 2 days after what I consider to be a tragic US election, for a number of reasons, but I'm very concerned about the future of Ukraine at this time. So, how does the model change? And how quickly can you respond? Is it going to bust the game? I'm just really curious about what's going on y'all's end right now.
So in the basic version, we focused on the first 18 months of the war. And what we did is we added events at the beginning of the round. So we could see, for example, the reaction of Turkey or the weapon deliveries from different countries. And this means that our Polymatrix game in its current state does not touch upon the latest elections. But what we were thinking about is if we would go a step further and we could also model the mediators in this conflict. I would like to indeed look at the successful negotiations that were happening in reality. And that did not come from the West. It was not US, it was not Poland, it was not France that was being the mediator for that. It was Turkey. If we speak about the grain trade, it was Saudi Arabia for prisoners of war. So this was for me fascinating that we have to look outside of our normal thinking in terms of political mediation. On the other side, if we look at the pragmatic things of, for example, land and lease, yes, what will happen with that after the events? Likely we would include this as a consequence. So we would look at the change in the resources of both sides based on the outcomes of the elections. But we are yet to see those decisions. So I'm also sitting on a very hot chair to see how we will be able to recognize the impact of the decisions in US.
Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, only very negative thoughts, but I mean, I don't think it's a problem for the game itself. I think that it's if people can project themselves back in time, which is what we do with historical war games. You know, they're over, they're finished, and so I guess you can have what's the expression? You have hindsight, so that can affect you. Whereas here we have a situation which is not resolved even now, but even in the early stages of the war, the conflict, it wasn't. There was nothing. It was all contingent. So I think that it's possible for students to see. To imagine what it's like at the initial stages, and they have, as Natalia, we talked about this with Natalia, and I think you said, didn't you, that students have a general knowledge about they have an idea of the geography. They know roughly about the geography at the moment. If they've been following the news a little bit, they are familiar with a lot of the issues and the events to do with the pipeline, to do with the grain, like you said, the grain negotiations. So I think that I wouldn't see the changing situation now as affecting the game itself. And anyway, the game, as far as I can see anyway, from a game perspective, what's really fascinating is that you can the way that it was put together graphically, and so on, in terms of the cards, mechanically. This is the first Matrix game I've really been able to explore and see in detail, and I would have thought it wouldn't be that difficult to update it or to transfer it to another context. It would be interesting, by the way, linguistically, just to see what would happen if you'd used a more exotic. It's already pretty exotic for some students. I'm thinking about my students, maybe not your students, but I mean, but if you used imaginary countries, for example, I think it would be actually quite difficult, because you say, why are we talking about a pipe? Why are we talking about grain or pipeline or whatever? What quite difficult. It's actually very useful to have a concrete example. I had hesitation. I was thinking, I don't want to see conflict beyond the Cold War, really. I mean, anything new. I'm not really a big fan of war games that are dealing with things that are still, hard for people to deal with. The Falkland Malvinas conflict, for example, for me is interesting, but I mean, I don't really want to touch it. I know that it's there on my shelf, but I actually find it a little uncomfortable. I even find it uncomfortable to deal with, Second World War or First World War, and despite the fact that there are so many good games out there. But to talk about it, I think this conflict is actually really important, whether it's within the context of Natalia's course or elsewhere, actually. I wouldn't hesitate about showing this particular game to my own students.
So one more question, I guess, before we lose Natalia. I think it might be the hardest one. So if the model is not indicating that peace is a likelihood, what have we learned from this game? And, have we learned hopelessness, or have we learned that maybe there are ways to approach that are more conducive to a good solution to this?
I think we can now model something I called obstacles to peace, and we can split it into factors that are preventing successful negotiations. So, on one side, linguistically, we can look where is the highest tension, or what are these flat out negations. So, what are the borders or limits of diplomacy? And there we have to look for an alternative solution, as you have mentioned. And we can also look at conditions under which these negotiations happen the most. So does it happen where we have more military clashes or less? Does it happen when there is a tie, when the military assets are more or less of equal power? So we can look first at what is stopping the negotiations for peace. And again, being objective, it can be on both sides. So we can see those connections. We can also look at the long-term prospects. So if we plan it out in the 18 months, all of the resources that are sent to both sides, what does that do also to the willingness to negotiate? Does it not, in fact, show us that this will boost the military actions, but we are not working diplomatically on the same moment? So the question is, can we find a sequence of different options that would lead to a formula for peace? I am not skeptical, but I am realistic that we have not found it yet, meaning even with multiple groups, we were able to map what I just outlined, the obstacles, the factors, the sequences of negotiations, but we were not able to see one that was leading into an all-out cease of hostilities. So the question is, what then? That I don't know if that is the next game or we can still take it into this format. Because what would be the alternatives to still de-escalate the conflict?
Interesting. And then, you've had several groups of people play this game. I was in one of them, and I actually knew a couple of the participants, which was really nice. But what types of people are playing this game, and do you think that is impacting your results in any particular way?
I am sure of that. I was not popular when I said it, but in one of my presentations, I said that we should also look at players as a source of information and also their level of performance, because that impacts the results that we can record. And why I said that was actually an experiment 2 years ago where we compared diplomats military and students. And I was just interested how well they could predict what is happening in a given conflict. And the students were the highest. They could do 75%, which is better than analysts and AI. So that was very interesting to notice why we have such good prediction. But on the other side, military was around 50%. I think because they were very focused on their specialization. And then we came to diplomats, and I don't like to say it, but their score was like 23%. And I will say why. Yeah, it's not that they are a failure or anything, but I think the reason why is students have the most intellectual freedom. They are precisely able to see the situation and say that would be the best move. Whereas for military, it's like what makes sense out of operational planning. Yeah, so they frame it into all of the knowledge they have. And diplomats, at least in the context we invited them into, I think their biggest goal was preservation of situation, status quo. So actually, for them, completely unrealistic that they would initiate anything. So that made a very low prediction. But based on that, and also in our game, you could see that the level of player, one, technically, how versed they are with the method of wargaming, two, expertise, how well they know the area, and third, how well they can engage into it. Somehow objectively, yeah, taking into account just what is the best move for Russia in that situation, putting aside our feelings of that. So that produces huge differences in what we can find.
So, quick follow on to that before I talk about language stuff. What about the judges? What kinds of variants are you seeing in the judging? And what range of realistic or things that are considered to be realistic things are you seeing, like, I guess, in their assessments? And is that impacted by their backgrounds and who they are?
Definitely, because they have to see on one side if it makes sense as an action and if it is argued well. But we noticed, for example, on the side of participants, some people will speak in lists. So they will enumerate because of this, and that. And linguistically, but also technically, it looks like a better idea if there is a multitudes behind it. Whereas if somebody says, well, I would do this because, and they will finish. And I think there are cultures where this is very popular. Just make your point short and in one sentence. Also, it belongs very much to military communication. It is perceived by the judges as a weaker argument because it was shorter. It's not necessarily so, right? It could be a better question. So, for the judges, it's important to look at specifically the strength of the arguments, but I think it is influenced well by the language side of things.
Oh, that is very interesting. All right. So, Chris, I've been winding up. What are you seeing in your work that kind of complements what Natalia's seeing just observationally as she records these sessions?
It's a really interesting observation. Just to follow up, yeah, thank you for that question. Natalia just mentioned a fundamental difference in the way people set up the arguments, which is called rhetorical structure. And I hate to bring it back to the American elections, but let's look at, in the French culture years ago, it was considered to be, absolutely obligatory. You had to be able to construct an argument and present yourself in an elegant, you see pictures of, French politicians in front of chandeliers, and the discourse is, it can be very, very ornate from an English speaking point of view, Anglo-Saxon point of view. But looking at, there has been work on tons of work, much more work on political discourse and business negotiation than on game discourse. That's why we're doing this project, actually, because it's there's not going to be any big surprises, but there's just less work on how people talk the language of gaming, and than in other discourse types. But if you look at political discourse and you look at the work that's been done on Trump, for example, his speech style is asyndetic. It just doesn't it doesn't respect syntactic. It breaks all sorts of communicative, what we used to think of as communicative rules, that you have to speak grammatically, that you have to speak clearly, that you have to make sense or be coherent. and it obviously it doesn't work like that. Our expectations of, that breaks down everything, all of our rules to do with communication and what works. So I'm very interested in what Natalia said there. Now there definitely we need to address that in the research, I think. We need to look at that, because that's really where we can say something concrete about how successful negotiation works and how unsuccessful negotiation works as well. That is to say, you've successfully pulled out of negotiate. You might be doing it for rhetorical purposes, but your actual purpose is not to have a successful negotiation as well. So we have to think about how the metagame is in operation as well. I think it's really. I just can't wait to get back to my data.
I think that also brings me to a larger question that I, for a year or two, already have on my desk, and that is instrumentalization. So that was actually what you were asking. So how do we make sure that the method of wargaming can be measured and it is valid in what the results are? And I thought that precisely the transcripts, the linguistic analysis, will be a fantastic step to look at those dependencies. So we might find there some modifiers that we have to take into account when we are presenting the results. So one of the things Chris and Lishao proposed was which language is English for you? So if it's your second, third language, you might have less proficiency or confidence, and that can influence as well your performance in the game.
If you're an Italian and if you have Italians negotiating, all of the players are Italian, but they're negotiating in English, the speech style might be very different if half of them are Italians and half of them are Chinese, or whatever their first languages are. And that is a variable that has been demonstrated in other negotiation contexts, business negotiation, in English, right? We're just looking at English as the language, but you can speak English and speak different discourses. That's what we learn. That's what we learn in the American elections. You all
That
speak
is
English.
very interesting. So yeah, I mean, I always perceive Europeans English, or people from other countries who have English, as so good. Like, to me, I'm like, well, damn, like y'all's English is great, especially compared to my like horrible attempts at like Spanish or whatever, right? So to me, like, I'm always just impressed. But I guess that, yeah, you might from the other side, right? It's probably doesn't feel as natural as it sounds some of the time. So I guess my question then is, across the people that y'all have been studying, what general things can you say about people kind of operating outside of language number one? But then also, are you seeing different patterns in people who learned their English in the same place or in the same educational style or in the same culture? Because I feel like somebody who learned English in a British school across the world would have some English quirks that aren't like mine that we just don't think about. Especially since I'm a dirty American, I speak dirty American English. So.
Your remarks are, forgive me, very, very interesting from a sociolinguistic point of view. First of all, people's self-opinion of their own language being, in your case, negative, is highly interesting as a kind of piece of data, and it shows that Natalia's had to leave us there. We have so many questions for her because she's a real non-native speaker. We don't use that word anymore, by the way. We don't talk about non-native speaker, but something like a second language user, or English as an additional language to valorize.
We have like teaching English as a second language, or yeah.
Well, yeah, just to come back to your view of your own English, I think that's very interesting, because from a pure linguistic point of view, everybody's English, just talking about English, is valuable and interesting. And I spend a lot of time with my students talking about the different varieties of American English, simply because, and North American English, I should say, because in your part of the world, actually, that is where the vowel system in English is evolving very, very quickly. And you can go and watch YouTube videos by one of the greatest linguists still alive, I think, is William Labov. And he talks about Minnesota and the Great Lakes vowel change. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The great vowel change that has been taking place in the
No,
last few
I've lived here for
decades.
4 months. We'll find out what happens to me.
You're sitting in the middle of a great vowel change storm, and the language is evolving. English language is evolving, and that is just unstoppable. It changes at different speeds and so on. But your variety of English is in some ways more conservative than British English. British English has evolved very quickly since independence, and since the American and British English varieties have split, they moved in different directions. But that doesn't mean to say that American English has declined and British English represents some kind of static, pure variety, right?
No, I think it's well, one, my English is very slangy, and I'm fine with that. I just laugh about it. But also, I think that Americans perceive British accents as very classy. Like that's the accent that is in all of the Roman epics. Or, I remember after we watched that Alexander movie forever ago, I was like, was it Oliver Stone Alexander with Colin Farrell?
That's Colin Farrell is talking with an Irish accent.
So we had a big giggle after watching it of Bucephalus. You will be my horn.
But it's a great film because that's just well, you've unfortunately chosen a counterexample because all the Macedonians have an Irish accent.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
That is very. I don't know if it's very subtle, but it means that really is great. I thought that was superb. No, that was great.
And I Claudius is also like a major basis for my own like pop culture.
As if if the percentage of the population of Britain, let's just talk about England because you have to discount Ireland and you have to discount Scotland and Wales. How many people actually sound like the character, like I Claudius? They only a tiny fraction. And that's because they are actors, they're acting with received pronunciation. So it's a Hollywood. It's whatever the British equivalent of Hollywood is. That's the accent that you're hearing.
I also had a friend in grad school who mocked my American vowels all the time. So she had this like beautiful. She was Irish, but she had this beautiful, like kind of Oxford sounding accent. And she'd be like, "Oh damn," and then she would make fun of me, and she'd be like, "Damn, ass," like those like flat vowels.
I think if you listen to every single word we've said during this conversation, we do not have there isn't a single word that is pronounced the same. And the thing is that if you're not let's say a regular speaker of English and you've learnt it as an additional language, they don't hear these differences, or they're just not aware of the difference. So I have fun with my students showing that there's a website called it's called, I've forgotten what it's called now, but it's a huge resource and you just click and you can listen to these, you can visualize where the person is and you can hear what they're saying. There's a little extract written down. And so that is absolutely brilliant. It's called IDEA, the International Database of English Accents. And so people like me, language geeks, spend all their time doing this.
Oh, that is delightful. So I guess so it sounds like you do quite a broad range of linguistic research. How did you end up working on this polymatrix game? Is this something that is normally in your wheelhouse, or is it like an interesting project that's like on the side of the research you normally do?
No, thank you for the question. It's a really nice question because we get back to games, and as you can see, I'm a gamer, and I'm really enjoying the comeback of analog games over the last 10, 20 years. I started with analog games, with board games, then went into role-playing games, video games. But I've never before managed to get games to meet my interest in languages. So they're always separate spheres of interest. But like I said, I was during lockdown, I was watching playthroughs and thought, why don't I do conversation analysis? I'd never done it before. So I'm interested in the question I have is, what do you think about games about language that deal with language? So things like, so you can go from things like Scrabble. You can see bananagrams behind me there, where language is instrumentalized, but it's not language. Or you have games like diplomacy, where language is absolutely essential. I mean, you can play diplomacy. I think the question you asked, Natalia, was interesting, because how do you engineer negotiation? Well, in diplomacy, there is a negotiation phase. There's the diplomacy phase in a game of diplomacy, or these political games where you have to negotiate. You can play it like a chess game where no communication whatsoever, but that seems to me to defeat the role-playing side of that. So anyway, sorry, to answer your question briefly, it's quite difficult to join the two together. If you look on language games that actually operationalize language, there's only one or two maybe that actually do that. On Board Game Geek, language is usually just quiz games, or it's letter games, spelling games that instrumentalize very low-level features of language, like spelling or recognizing expressions. If you type idiom on Board Game Geek, you'll just find quiz games and things like that. There's one role-playing game which I don't know. Have you heard of Dialect?
Yes, I have. Where have I heard of this? Like, this sounds really familiar.
Thorny Games.
Yes.
That uses language, right? They actually, this is one of the very few, I want to show this to my students, and maybe an adapted version. So what you do is you have a community that is isolated, and it's one of these modern role-playing games where there isn't a game master, but you have kind of like cards. You can, or you invent a word, or you can use a normal English word, and you state how that word changes meaning at one stage in the story. Then the story moves on to another stage, and so it's about actually language change and how a dialect emerges from your isolated community. And I thought that was the closest I've seen in game terms to a game that actually takes language and uses language as part of the mechanics of the language. It's not just in the interactions between the players, like diplomacy, or any game requires communication, even chess, very basic forms of communication. But a game that actually takes language and takes the matter of language, the systems of language, the structures, the functions of language. I can't think of any other examples.
That's so interesting. Also, I took a quick look into the past. Yes, I've interviewed Catherine Hines about sign, but we haven't talked about dialect. So now you've given me like I should like come back around.
She might be he or she might be behind Xenolanguage as well, which is about
yes, the alien language game. Yeah.
That's first cool. Contact type game as well. I think that's really that would be the closest. If you think, what film could we think of that is the closest to language analysis embodied in a film? It's very difficult to deal with language as a topic. It's easier to deal with conflict or money, or, or murder. Cluedo.
Yeah.
Monopoly. But language is pretty difficult. It's pretty abstract.
So I have a question. I have a couple questions for you about your research before I let you go. One, so you mentioned that some of what you can kind of hear is tonal as opposed to just like the actual words that come out of somebody's mouth. How do you quantify that? And how much of that is instinct versus what you can talk about in like a data kind of way?
Oh, it's almost more. There's more research on spoken language tones and intonation than there is on phraseology, for example. It's quite counterintuitive, but there's tons of research out there in particular in negotiation studies. So you have a whole corpus of data now where people they can identify conflict, they can identify when people are cooperating. In the Matrix game, in Natalia's Matrix game, we have examples where if I just look at the written text, which I did initially, I started off with the written text, I would label something as a statement, whereas in fact the tone is a question. When you actually hear what the person says it as a question. So that means that really do have to hear the audio at the same time as look at the extracts. So it's actually quite easy to train AI now to recognize that. That is recognizable. That
Okay.
falling intonation, rising intonation, that's actually easier to analyze than than phraseology and the idiomatic expressions. You still need to have a linguist reading those and trying, because they're by nature, by definition, they're ambiguous. You can say one thing and mean something else.
I really want to come back to AI, but first, I also want to ask, like, our stuff was recorded, I believe, audio and video. How important is seeing someone's face or affect to this work, or can you just do it off of sound? Like, what does the full picture give you versus just the noise part?
It could go both ways. I think we've got recordings where we just have an odd angle and we can see a building. we can barely see the board, so you can't see what's going on the board, and you can't see the players. I mean, for scientific reasons, we have to anonymize our data, and if that data is used outside the context of the project, that compromises the data. So we have to get the participants to agree to take part in the project, and one of the conditions for that is that the data, that their identities will not be divulged. So we can't really use, we shouldn't really be using the visual data. However, there is a lot of research out there, linguistic research on gesture and facial gesture. So when you nod, for example, during the Zoom, during these streaming sessions, for example, if we have a video, that's part of the conversation. That's analyzable. It's not just decoration. I mean, people nod, people shake their hands, people make faces. It's called, the term I think is facial gesture. And so that is also analyzable. It's just like sign language. It's analyzable and it's part of the data. And so in theory, we should be looking at that. But we're not. It would be really complicated. First of all, Natalia didn't do, the first idea was to do a Zoom session where everybody has their face and we can see the board. Because the board, if you're talking about the board, you're talking about what's going on in Kherson or in some city in Ukraine. It's useful for us to follow that, because they say, I moved 3 of these over here. Well, that's a typical gaming phrase, a performance, but it's taking place on the board, so it's obvious. It's called deictic reference outside the context, in context reference, which means everybody knows what we're talking about. But if you're just looking at the language, the words, you can't tell what they're doing. So you need to have the board a lot of the time. I wouldn't show these recordings to my students before showing them the board, or having your session, for example, is really good, because you have the board we have the board on the screen and we have the players on one side, so we can follow what's going on.
Oh, that's really interesting. And then for AI, people who follow my channel know I'm staunchly against generative AI, like using it to replace artists, or I'm really not a fan of ChatGPT. I think it produces terrible writing, but that doesn't mean that AI is useless. So it sounds like you are using it in your study. So how is it working? And then I guess, how do you balance the need for human input and checking with what the AI component is able to do?
I'd be very interested in hearing some of your podcasts about this, if you have any, because there are some board game boxes, aren't there, where they say this game, there's a symbol they use, an icon, which says AI has not been involved in the graphic analysis. To be honest with you, I don't use any of these, even the corpus linguistics. I'm very old-fashioned. I'm in the Neolithic period of corpus linguistics. I just look at concordances online. I just look at the words, and I don't even do any statistical analysis anymore. My students do that, my PhD students. Li Chao, however, if you talk with him, he will give you a different perspective, because he's using AI, for example, for the voice recognition. First of all, the AI's, that is it's important for us to have both, isn't it? I mean, if I've done I was transcribing Callendale, I was transcribing another podcast on games, and I was doing it manually, but now all of that can be done automatically using AI. So the thing is, if a linguist doesn't know how to transcribe spoken language, they don't know how difficult it is, and they don't see the problems involved, and They can't judge the quality of the output. But to be honest with you, if I've got 1 hour or 2 hours of transcription, that could take days, that could take weeks. So the AI is really important for us anyway to get that data, but it is frightening because for each data point, just a single second. I've listened to presentations on phonetics, looking at tone, for example, or looking at just phonetic analysis of conversation, and a single data point generates dozens and dozens and dozens of variables, actually hundreds of variables. So who's talking, what time they were talking, all of the different identity variables for each speaker, what they were doing, where it fits in with the rest of the data, and that's just for one single syllable, in an entire conversation. And that is a frightening amount of data. And you think, who is keeping this data? How the data has to be kept somewhere. It has to be kept alive. It has to be fed with electricity, I assume, and therefore that has to be fed with maybe fossil fuels or whatever it is that is. So there's a huge data problem in that if we record absolutely everything and we have to have access to all of the data points, that is crazy. And it does mean that analysts, I'm sorry about this, my analog perspective is that the linguist, a lot of linguists, I fear, may not be able to do, in fact, I think I know that they're not able to do a manual or visual eyeball analysis of a text, simply because they rely, part of speech recognition, that can be done automatically now. This is a noun, this is an adjective, this is a verb. Well, if the analyst doesn't know how to do this, I think we have lost something there. By the way, do you mind if I raise another question?
Not at all.
And that is, what do you think about the AI getting involved in playing games of diplomacy? Or AI?
I know nothing about that. Is it just people? Is it AI that's like helping people decide what to do, or is it playing in the place of a person?
I think that might be it. I think the paper, I've seen a couple of papers which are on the periphery of my research, but I think that we do need to look at it from our project point of view. We do need to be aware that there are computational linguists and other computational people looking at AI playing, actually AI, ChatGPT, actually not just running a role-playing game, which think I'm tempted to try. If I try D&D, try and get GPT to, because nobody else will play D&D with me. But if I, if I get ChatGPT to play D&D, maybe I can scratch that itch. But I mean, they're actually using some kind of AI to play diplomacy. Now, that's kind of frightening, isn't it? Because that is really handing out, who has the responsibility for pressing the nuclear button.
That, but also, like, I don't know, I feel like that would mess up the vibe of diplomacy, in the sense that people play diplomacy in order to negotiate. Like, the personal relationships are the fun. So if you just kind of like put some computers to it, that's not fun. But the other thing is that, first of all, I think that a program can only do what its programmer taught it to do. So it might be very intelligent, but I don't know if it's reflective of the right answers. But then also, I think that people make flawed decisions because we see things in flawed ways. And if you want to learn something about human leaders and about their decision making, then the AI will teach you nothing.
Well, the AI has biases. The AI, all of the flaws you're talking about are there in the AI because it's encoded. So there's gender bias. There's all sorts of biases about discourse biases.
Yeah, but how do we even quantify that? Like, how do you understand your own level of bias and how it makes you treat someone? I think that there is no person who can honestly see it in themselves. So how do you teach a computer to do it? And also, why are we teaching computers to be as gross as we are? Like, you could just find an old set in his ways man for that. Like,
well, I'm afraid you're talking. Yeah, my view on it is very old school and very I'm very skeptical about it. I don't use social media and so on. So, but I have to say, the majority of people now, the majority of posts, if we're talking about posts in academia, in linguistics nowadays, if you don't use a corpus, if you don't use AI, if you're not interested in talking about neural machine translation. For example, I teach translation and linguistics, and
Yeah.
if you don't use, I have to use DeepL, I have to use these machine translation, but I teach my students never to use the same results. They have to change. They have to reformulate. Right, this business of not accepting the first thing you say. There are millions of ways of, well, hundreds of ways of saying the same things. You have to say it differently. But that's taking responsibility. But I think that I'm swimming against the tide. A few years ago, I took part in a diplomacy tournament in Strasbourg. I'm not very competitive, but I just had to scratch that itch, and so I took part. I always feel bad after a game of diplomacy. We always get really badly beaten, and this guy just turned up 2 or 3 hours late. He just turned up. He took over, one of these countries that had been lying dormant, waiting for somebody to take over. You weren't allowed to move the pieces, and he just moved. He didn't talk to anybody, he didn't negotiate, he didn't take part, he didn't roll. So for me, that, like you said, I don't see the fun in that. I mean, apart from a sadistic kind of fun.
That's really interesting. I guess then, how do we? So I sort of see gaming as a human enterprise. I see negotiating as a human enterprise. How do we kind of tie all this back and like bring it full circle to what we're seeing in this Polymatrix game? Because I feel like what Natalia is expressing about peace, the inability to get there, it's partially structure. I think it's partially our perceptions of Russia and Ukraine and how they relate to each other, and then how that plays out in people who are role playing from, with those impressions. But then I don't know, how do we actually get a real look at how we communicate if we're not doing it on a human level?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. I think what I would do is point to another area of research which I'd love to talk about with you and Natalia, and that is it's called language policy and language planning. There's a guy called Joseph Lubyanka who spent his entire career designing language policies, and his current research is on language in conflict and language of conflict and peace negotiation. So he spends his time studying peace negotiation. So not conflict resolution, but peace negotiation. The perspective is changed, and I think that might be one way of looking at it. Is how I guess in the Polymatrix game, what we could do, I guess, is look at from a linguistic point of view, look at the point where, look at the kind of postures that people are adopting when they finally realize that they are on the losing end of the game. And so you can say, well, at this point, there is a realization that I'm not going to be able to do any better than this. My support has shifted, or my support has withered away. For example, you can imagine a late stage version of the game where, unfortunately, where we're heading, maybe, where people adopt that posture, maybe. I was also thinking, if we had the opportunity to do this project again, and hopefully we will renew the project and get funding to continue with this, asking slightly different questions, whether Natalia would be interested in looking not at the direct negotiation, but how people talk on their own side. So they'd have 2 people on the same team, or 3 or so. You'd have a team of people, and actually looking at their conversation. So we're not talking about adversaries negotiating, but people negotiating how they are going to communicate with the other side. And then you would get different postures. Do we? How do we? So you could even just then look at the strategic, tactical, how they actually make those kind of decisions. I think there are wargame groups. There are Pack Sims people doing that in places like London and so on.
Interesting. Fascinating. All right, so now we're going to have to just put a pin in this so that we can have another conversation after more stuff has happened. But for now, I'm going to just ask you my softy questions. So one, what have you been playing recently that brings you some joy?
Oh no, I'm just going to start complaining, because in fact I've been playing stuff which has not brought me joy, which has really tired me out and made me think, oh no, I can't play this. I can't.
Name and shame.
I did play a war game called The Banish All Their Fears, which is a GMT, a really beautifully produced, GMT game about the bayonet and musket period. And I just get that out, and it takes a day to set it up. and it takes half a day for me to realize I don't have time to play it. So then I put it away. So that's
No,
I
no, you're
very
supposed to
rarely
leave it
play a game.
out.
Sorry?
Leave it out.
Oh no, no, no! I wouldn't be allowed to do that. I mean, it takes up too much space. So I'm very frustrated. This is why I want to do this with my students, because I'm very frustrated. I need to take part in some games. So if if you have any ideas in this, I would be very interested in. I've not done role play for a long, long time, and so I've got out. I get out so these solo role play games. I don't know if you've seen them. Things like
Oh,
RuneQuest,
absolutely.
this little boxed version like RuneQuest or Pendragon. So I'll sit through the booklet, and but I'm like studying it rather than actually playing it.
Gotcha. Well, I will say, for those of you out there, she's been on the podcast a couple times. The person for checking out interesting solo RPGs is Deborah from Geek Gamers on YouTube.
Right. I've watched her video. She does like a video every day or something.
She's awesome. Yeah, I think the world of her. Also, if you want to do writing stuff, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is always like a good standard solo.
What's that?
It's a game by Tim Hutchings called 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, and you basically create a vampire character and you write about them through time, and they like lose memories and they become more messed up until they inevitably are destroyed because nothing is forever.
I'm looking for those kind of recommendations. Something it has to be fairly light. I've got Star Trek, the Star Trek Adventures one but it's kind of like it's what's it called? Star Trek something or other, and it has quite a good introduction to all the different Star Trek universes. But I would need to take a couple of days off to do that and sit down and do that. But I mean, I feel that a game like Dialect, I would like to play with that. If anybody out there is interested, please get in touch. I've listened to a couple of podcasts about that, and I think you really only get an idea of how to play it by sitting through the podcast and listening how it works. I'd like to see how that works with people interested in language and linguistics. And I'm kind of tempted to take that to my students. I have asked to set up a course called Matrix Games, which I know nothing about, but I've decided to ditch one of my courses, and I'm going to do this with my students in a year's time. And
that's awesome. Yeah, you only got to be one step ahead of the students, so you'll be all right.
But any ideas? I'm really keen to hear about that. Yeah, something light. I think I wouldn't be. Something like Diplomacy is so simple. I think something like Virgin Queen. I don't know, or something. I'd love to do that, but I mean, they're just
big.
It would take weeks and weeks and weeks. And but something like I got out to Virgin Queen or Here I Stand, and for me that unfortunately I'm alone. So I'm so Beyond Solitaire, I think is a great name because
have I got some recommendations for you? But if other people have recommendations for you, if they want to follow your work, where can you be found online?
I'm at Christopher.Gledhill at u.Paris, but I think if you Google me, you'll find that's my latest university in Paris. Yeah.
Fantastic. And for everybody else out there, I can be found everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Hopefully that's obvious by now. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. This is super fascinating. I really enjoyed this.
I've really enjoyed this, and I hope we can meet again.
Absolutely. All right, everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.